Question for you. What is the number one mistake you can make when writing a paper? I don't know. Not writing at all? Writing in invisible ink? I just asked that question as a kind of hook for this video. I do know, though, that writing a good introduction can help elevate the quality of your writing. So, what do you want to accomplish in an introduction? What's the point? Well, we might think of our essay as having this structure: an introduction where we say what we're going to say, a body where we say it, and a conclusion where we say what we've just said. I'd refine this slightly, though, to say that your introduction is where you let your reader know what you're going to be talking about and what your point is. The body is where you prove your point, and the conclusion is where you say what your point matters. With this in mind, we know that in our introduction, we need to tell our reader what our topic is, perhaps what our particular slant on that topic is, and of course, we need to provide our thesis. Now, if in addition to doing those things, we can be interesting, well, that is just the icing on the cake. And you like that I'm putting another kind of food besides just a sandwich in this video? So here's a simple recipe for introductions. Start out by making the writing engaging, if you can. Let the reader know the paper's topic, including the text you're going to be discussing, and then provide the thesis. Let me give you a couple of examples of this pattern in practice. Here's one that's an intro to a literary analysis essay. I know that underneath your glamour, Grendel's mother tells the hero Beowulf, "You're as much a monster as my son Grendel." That's my hook. It's a quote from a film. Her comment points out a significant difference between Robert Zemeckis' 2000 film version of the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf and the poem itself. In the film, the hero himself is monstrous, but the monsters are almost as sympathetic as they are evil. I've let my reader know the text I'm going to be talking about and what particular aspect of those texts I'm going to discuss. While the poem presents characters who are black and white, good and evil, straightforward and simple, the characters in the film are much more complex. The changes to these characters suggest that in today's world, even a hero can be a little bit of a monster. So here's my thesis. I want to point out that while the epic poem presents very simple characters, you know who's good, you know who's bad, in the film the characters are more nuanced, they're more blended. And I think that relates to our culture today. Now here's that same pattern in a position paper. Americans are addicted to a fine white powder. No, it's probably not what you're thinking. Most Americans' drug of choice isn't cocaine or crushed OxyContin. It's sugar. The average American daily consumes over twice the amount recommended by the American Heart Association, an addiction that adds up to 57 pounds of added sugar per person every year. And guys, that's like a 5-year-old child made of sugar. Well, no one wants the government telling them what they can or can't eat. The health risks posed by this glut of sweetness demand government intervention. The federal government should treat sugar like a controlled substance and require the same types of warning labels on foods with excessively high sugar that it does on cigarette packs. In the thrall of our own addiction, we need help to help ourselves. You should be able to see there, I've got a hook, I've let my reader know what I'm talking about, and then I've given my reader my thesis, my position. And here's the intro to an informational essay about, you guessed it, blenders. Smoothies, sauces, dips, and soups. Many of our favorite foods have been made possible by a humble but mighty invention, the blender. First created to make soda fountain drinks and later popularized by the man who taught America to sing, the blender has become ubiquitous in American kitchens, cafeterias, and even hospitals. Although blenders are small, they have greatly increased the culinary possibilities in our diet. Sure, we could live without them, but would we want to? I know that last sentence is super corny. I just couldn't help myself. Now that's well and good, you may say, for a piece of school writing, but do real writers, published writers, actually follow this pattern? If we leave the zoo of school, can we spot this pattern in the wild of writing? And my answer to that is, yeah, sometimes. Obviously, writers use a range of strategies for starting their writing, and you should start paying attention to that. But you will see with some modifications, this pattern show up in a lot of different areas. So here's the intro to an article about chewing gum, a sort of health wellness article. Don't swallow your gum, it'll clog up your insides. Mums have warned us for generations. Their message was simple. Swallow gum would either stay in your stomach for years, block up your intestines, or both. You'd be in pain, there would be an inevitable trip to the emergency department, and no doubt, and I told you so afterwards. But what really happens if you swallow your gum? Dr. Nitin Gupta, a pediatric gastroenterologist at Sydney's Children's Hospital, Randwick, says that for most people, nothing at all. Lots of people swallow gum, says Gupta, but complications are pretty rare. However, there are documented cases of people who swallowed gum, considerable amounts, and ended up with a blockage in the gut. So we've got a first sentence there that's a little bit of a hook. You've heard those words before, right? That middle section there lets you know what this article is talking about, swallowing gum and what happens to it. And then the blue part there tells you the main point that this article is going to make, that most people can swallow gum without a problem, but every now and then if you swallow an awful lot, you can end up with a blockage. And I can't think of much that would be grosser than that, so I'm going to stay on the safe side and not swallow my gum. Now let's take a look at an intro to an essay which was published in Bicycling in 1991. Hello. She appeared on my right shoulder, her face is inches from mine. We were cycling together, though I'd never seen her before. We rode side by side through the city of Beijing, and around us streamed thousands of bicycles with red banners flying. Beijing was in revolt, and as we rode together, we broke the law. What a great beginning, right? Fred Strebe has put us right there in a scene, right on a moment of dialogue. I'm intrigued. I want to know what's going on. Then he pulls back, and he says where he is and why he's there. I had gone to China with an odd goal, to learn a bit about what the bicycle means to people who live in a country with only a few thousand privately owned cars, but some 220 million cycles, vastly more than any other nation. And I had arrived at an odd time. Now, that sentence I highlighted in blue, I don't think if you ask the writer that he would say that's his thesis statement. In fact, the main point of this essay, to me, seems to be that the bicycle is more than just a simple means of transportation for people in China at the time he wrote this essay. But he did happen to be in China during the spring of 1989, and that was when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, when government troops fired on students. It was a pretty famous and pretty terrible event that I remember back from when I was young. He discusses this event, and it is, to put it mildly, an odd time. So that sentence there does set us up for a lot of what's going to be discussed in this essay. Maybe not his thesis statement, but certainly letting us know a major point of his essay. Let me show you just really quickly the intro to an article by Malcolm Gladwell, who, by the way, is my nerd crush. I'm not going to read you the introduction to this article because it's a little too long for this video, but let me just scroll through here and show you what I'm seeing. Gladwell starts off by telling the story of how young Ted Turner decided to purchase a radio station that seemed like it could be a real risk. And the story lasts for several paragraphs, until finally we get to this paragraph here. Well, Gladwell seems to, not to switch topics, but finally clues us into the point of his writing here, where he discusses a recent study from predators to icons, and what that study has found about what successful entrepreneurs have in common. And then finally here at the end of this paragraph, we get his point. The truly successful businessman is anything but a risk taker. He's a predator, and predators seek to incur the least risk possible while hunting. We may have this idea that entrepreneurs are people who are willing to make huge gambles in order to succeed. But the point is, he's saying, or Gladwell is saying, that they really aren't gambling, that they're not these huge risk takers. Instead, they see these opportunities that other people might not see. They make sure that these opportunities are a pretty sure thing, and then they take advantage. And to those of us who didn't see the opportunities clearly, that looks like a risk. And then he goes on and explains that with other examples here in the rest of the article. Now you can see it's a long article, and so it's okay to have a long introduction. But that story at the beginning gets us wondering, what's this paper going to be about? What's the point he's going to make here? What is Ted Turner seeing that we're not seeing here? And so I would say the whole story there functions as a hook. And then, of course, when we mention the article, that lets us know what we're talking about. And then finally, he gives us his point. So this is a very expanded version of the pattern that I've been talking about. Start looking for this pattern. You'll see it. Now that we've looked at some published examples, let's go ahead and apply this pattern to an essay you might write for school. For this example, I want to look at two addresses that were given by the President and First Lady after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. They're both great speeches. I prefer Eleanor Roosevelt's. So here's my thesis statement. While both addresses are appropriate for their purposes, Eleanor Roosevelt's more personal approach makes hers the speech that deserves to be remembered. Now I'm starting by jotting down my thesis. I'm working backward from that because in this kind of paper, everything needs to point to the thesis. It's the starting point. Now from here, I can think about what information my readers need to know so they can actually have a clue what I'm writing about. And I might say something like this. After Japanese forces attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, both Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt addressed the nation. The First Lady addressed listeners of a radio program on the evening of December 7th, offering words of comfort and confidence, while the President delivered a speech the next day asking Congress to declare a state of war. While both addresses are appropriate for their purposes, Eleanor Roosevelt's more personal approach makes hers the speech that deserves to be remembered. As far as I'm concerned, you could stop right here with your introduction. It does what it needs to do. It lets the reader know what you're talking about, and it lets your reader know the point you're going to make. If you have trouble coming up with a good hook, then there's nothing wrong with just getting down to business, getting into your topic. But let's say we do want to use a hook. Remember that the hook is that engaging piece of writing that we start on that makes our readers just want to read more. It's like their little fish that we've caught. They've been sucked into our writing. And if you're like me, you find this analogy incredibly violent, but hey, let's go with it. Let's say you try this for your hook. My paper will discuss Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt's addresses to the nation after Pearl Harbor. I would rather see no hook than a hook like that, because a hook like that is basically saying, here's my homework. And yes, I know it's your homework, but I would like to pretend that I'm just reading some really engaging essays that you guys wrote, because you're fabulous writers. I would also rather see no hook than a super generic hook like this. Have you ever heard a speech? I mean, yes, we're discussing speeches, but that line does nothing to prepare me mentally for what's to come here. Instead, when we try and come up with a good hook, we start with the thesis. We work backward from the thesis. So we say, what's the main point we want to get across here? And what is an interesting way that I can sort of prime my reader's brain for what's coming? In this case, maybe I'll start with the quote, "A day which will live in infamy," which is a pretty famous quote from the president's speech, and I'll work from there. Now, if I do start with this hook, what I find is that I actually have to change that middle bit a little bit to make it work. Again, I want these pieces to feel like they fit together, and if that means I need to tweak the wording as I go, no problem, I'm willing to do that. So here's what I've got. A date which will live in infamy. This is what President Franklin Roosevelt called December 7th, 1941, the day that Japanese forces attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The president's words are serious and harsh, and thus appropriate to his task when he spoke, to ask Congress to declare war against Japan. However, Roosevelt wasn't the first figure in the White House to respond to the attack, nor was his approach the only one. A day earlier, when First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt addressed the nation on a radio program, she offered words of comfort and confidence. While both addresses are appropriate for their purposes, Eleanor Roosevelt's more personal approach makes hers the speech that deserves to be remembered. All right, that works pretty well as an intro. And just to emphasize that point one more time, everything in your paper from the first sentence on ought to point the reader towards that thesis. Let's go through this process for one more text. In this case, let's look at A More Perfect Union, a speech delivered by Senator Barack Obama on March 18, 2008 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in response to some controversy over some remarks that his pastor had made. So I've read through the speech, I've thought about it, and I've thought, what do I like best in the speech? Here's my thesis. Obama's speech, A More Perfect Union, is an example of effective rhetoric because he successfully uses specific examples of real people to illustrate his larger concepts about America. Again, it's really easy to talk about freedom or justice or equality, but those words are fuzzy. If you want to make them real, you got to tie them to something specific. So here's my thesis again. I need to work back from the thesis. And so I'm thinking, first of all, is there some quote in the text that really sums up this idea that's a great line to start on? Or maybe I'm thinking, is there something about this topic that my reader can relate to? Maybe the idea of having heard a story and the story really stuck, or the idea of, seeing an ad that was talking about freedom and liberty and democracy, but really you had no clue what those concepts meant. I start from the thesis and work backward. I come up with some possibilities. Now, here are a few. I don't think any of them are fabulous, but, I'm just brainstorming. Any good politician needs to master the art of the soundbite, the ability to come up with one-line zingers that stick with the listener, even if they don't deliver a nuanced message. It's far more important, though, for a politician to present meaningful ideas that stick. And then from here, I go on to say that in the speech, and of course I give the title of the speech and the information about it, Obama manages to make his concepts stick by tying them to real examples. I could work with this. Okay, here's another. Justice, equality, prosperity. While most people would agree that they value these ideas, the words themselves are classic examples of glittering generalities. They sound good, but it can be difficult to tell what they really mean when, say, a politician drops them into a speech. Then from here I could say, in his speech, A More Perfect Union, Obama does more than just give us pretty words. He ties them to these really specific examples so we have a clear picture of what he means by them. Or here's another example, a little bit longer. Near the end of his speech, A More Perfect Union, delivered on March 18, 2008 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when he was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, then Senator Barack Obama tells the story of a moment of connection between two individuals, a 23-year-old white woman and an elderly black man who supported his campaign. It's a simple story, yet Obama uses it to make a larger point. That connection between people of different backgrounds, ages, and races is possible. This real-life example is not the only one Obama uses to illustrate his points. And then from there, I'll say that he uses multiple examples and that they really help bring the points home. I just want to reemphasize one more time that once you put the pieces together in your introduction, you may have to adjust the wording a little bit. You don't want your thesis to feel like it's just randomly stuck in at the bottom, nor do you want your hook to feel random. The whole thing needs to work together to lead your reader into that paper. And it is totally okay to tweak the wording of your thesis or of your hook to make it work. So here's a full introduction. When politicians make speeches, it's easy for them to speak in glittering generalities, using words like democracy and freedom that evoke positive feelings but lack substance. It's also easy for them to talk about difficult concepts such as race and vague terms that avoid conflict but also fail to provide solutions. In a speech, A More Perfect Union, delivered March 18, 2008, in the midst of heated debate over Obama's relationship with his former pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Obama discusses large concepts: equality, American ideals, and race relations. However, Obama's speech avoids lapsing into vague generalities or becoming just a string of sound bites because he gives flesh and blood examples of the larger concepts he discusses. The real-life examples he draws on, in particular those of himself, Reverend Wright and his grandmother, and Ashley, help clarify the contradictions embodied by real Americans and help make his call for unity seem more possible. Once again, here's that simple recipe for introductions. We want to make our writing engaging with a hook related to the thesis. We want to let our reader know the paper's topic, including the text we'll be discussing, and of course we need to provide the thesis. If we do these things, then we should be off to a great start.